On April 10, 1945, a man sat at his desk in a crumbling Berlin and dictated what would become his final preserved words to history. Joseph Goebbels, architect of one of the most devastating propaganda machines ever created, abruptly stopped writing his diary. The entry contained only dry military reports, no commentary, no reflection, nothing. 12 days later, on April 22nd, he moved his entire family into Adolf Hitler's underground bunker. For the next 9 days, as the Soviet army closed in and the Third Reich collapsed around him, Goebbels continued to document his thoughts. He dictated at least one more entry, possibly several. But these final pages never made it onto the glass microfilm plates that preserved the rest of his 22-year journal. They vanished. What did Joseph Goebbels write in those lost final days? What truths, delusions, or confessions filled those missing pages? And why did they disappear? To understand what might have been lost, we first need to understand who wrote it. Joseph Goebbels was not born into power. He was the son of a bookkeeper from Reich, Germany. He had a deformed foot, likely from childhood polio, that left him with a pronounced limp and an inferiority complex that would haunt him throughout his life. During World War I, while other young men went to war, Goebbels stayed home. The rejection stung deeply. He earned a doctorate in literature from Heidelberg University in 1921. He wanted to be a writer, a playwright, a novelist. He tried desperately to break into literary circles. Publishers rejected his work repeatedly. One of those publishers was owned by a Jewish businessman, a detail that Goebbels would not forget, and that would fuel his transformation into one of history's most virulent anti-Semites. In 1924, everything changed. Goebbels attended the trial of Adolf Hitler following the failed beer hall putsch. He was mesmerized. Here was a man who could move crowds with words alone. Hitler saw something in Goebbels, too, a brilliant, twisted mind that could spin reality itself into propaganda gold. By 1926, Hitler appointed Goebbels as district leader of Berlin. 2 years later, he became the Nazi Party's propaganda director for all of Germany. Goebbels created the myth of the Führer. He staged massive rallies. He choreographed spectacles of light and sound that transformed political theater into something approaching religious ceremony. When the Nazis seized power in 1933, Goebbels became Reich Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. He controlled newspapers, radio, film, theater, literature, and music. He orchestrated the burning of books deemed un-German in Berlin's Opera House Square. He was instrumental in launching Kristallnacht in 1938, the coordinated attack on Jewish businesses and synagogues that historians consider the beginning of the Holocaust. And through it all, from October 1923 until his death in May 1945, Goebbels kept a diary. Joseph Goebbels began his diary as a young, unemployed man living with his parents. A girlfriend of part Jewish heritage had given him the journal as a gift. His early entries were obsessive, detailing his turbulent relationship with Elsa Janke and his search for meaning in life. Historians who have studied the complete diaries describe the young Goebbels as isolated, preoccupied with religious and philosophical questions, lacking direction. Writing became a form of therapy, a way to process his anger, his ambition, his consuming need for validation. But here's what makes these diaries historically unprecedented. Goebbels almost never stopped writing. From 1923 onwards, he wrote nearly every single day. 22 years. More than 70,000 pages of typed dictation and handwritten notes. It represents one of the most comprehensive daily records ever produced by a high-ranking official of the Nazi regime. Historian Ian Kershaw described the diaries as vitally important for understanding Hitler's thinking and actions. Despite Goebbels's obvious biases and self-serving narratives, the sheer immediacy and frequency of his entries make them an invaluable window into the inner workings of the Third Reich. But there's a darker truth about these diaries that we need to understand. Goebbels was always writing for posterity. Even his most private thoughts were carefully curated performances. He wasn't just documenting history, he was trying to shape how history would remember him. And as defeat became inevitable, that obsession with his legacy grew more desperate. By November 1944, Goebbels knew Germany was going to lose the war. In one diary entry from that month, he wrote about how distant and alien the beautiful world seemed, noting that inwardly he had already taken leave of it. He faced a terrifying prospect. His life's work, his carefully constructed narrative, his justification for everything he had done, all of it could be lost when Berlin fell. The diaries might burn. They might be seized and destroyed by the Soviets. They might disappear forever. So Goebbels made a decision that would shape historical research for generations to come. He ordered that his entire diary collection be preserved using cutting-edge technology. Microfilm. A special darkroom was set up in Goebbels' apartment in central Berlin. His stenographer, Richard Otte, supervised the meticulous process. Every page was photographed onto glass plates. Each plate could hold multiple pages of text. The work was painstaking, expensive, and dangerous. Berlin was under constant bombardment. The last preserved microfilm entry is dated April 10, 1945. By that point, the Soviet army was closing in on Berlin from the east. American and British forces were advancing from the west. The Third Reich was collapsing in real time. The April 10th entry is strangely impersonal. It contains only a report on the military situation. No commentary from Goebbels. No analysis. No emotion. It reads like a man who had suddenly stopped caring, or who had suddenly become very, very afraid of what he might say. After the microfilm work was completed, the boxes of glass plates were sent to Potsdam, just west of Berlin, where they were buried for safekeeping. The original handwritten and typed diaries were packed and stored in the Reich Chancellery. The microfilm project was Goebbels' insurance policy, his bid for immortality. But it was incomplete. On April 22, 1945, Joseph Goebbels made a fateful decision. As the Soviet forces surrounded Berlin and the propaganda ministry evacuated, Goebbels moved in the opposite direction. He gathered his wife Magda and their 6 children, Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig, and Heidrun, ages 12 down to 4, and moved them into the Führer bunker complex beneath the Reich Chancellery. Other Nazi officials were fleeing to the south, hoping to surrender to the Americans or British rather than face Soviet capture. But not Goebbels. In his mind, leaving Hitler was unthinkable. His loyalty to the Führer was absolute, almost religious in its intensity. The bunker was a claustrophobic nightmare. Built 50 feet beneath the ground in 2 levels, it was cramped, damp, and crowded. Hitler occupied the lower level with his inner circle. The Goebbels family stayed in the upper level, the Vorbunker, with the children sleeping in a single room. Witnesses who survived the bunker described the Goebbels children as sad, though one nurse characterized them as charming and delightful. They played with Hitler's dog, Blondie. They sang songs for the wounded and for Hitler himself. They were, by all accounts, ordinary children trapped in an extraordinary nightmare by their parents' fanaticism. And during these final days in the bunker, Joseph Goebbels continued his lifelong habit. He dictated diary entries. We know this because multiple witnesses mentioned it. According to historian Hugh Trevor Roper, after dictating his last diary entry, Goebbels moved permanently into the Führer bunker to direct Hitler's final battles and his own propaganda efforts. But here's the mystery. That last entry has never been found. Neither has any entry between April 10th and Goebbels' death on May 1st. So what happened to those final pages? And more importantly, what did they contain? Let's establish what we know for certain. The documentary record gives us several crucial clues about those lost final days. First, we know Goebbels was still in the routine of dictating. His stenographer, Richard Otte, knew his handwriting, his habits, his style. The microfilm process had been Otte's responsibility, and notations in Otte's handwriting appear on the microfilm plates up until April 10th. Second, we know the physical limitations. The microfilm equipment wasn't in the bunker. It was in Goebbels' apartment. By April 22nd, when the family moved to the bunker, that apartment was no longer accessible. The microfilm glass plates had already been sent to Potsdam and buried. Any entries dictated after April 22nd had no mechanism for preservation through Goebbels' carefully planned system. Third, we have witness testimony. Hugh Trevor Roper's research, published in his edited volume of the final diary entries, explicitly states that Goebbels dictated at least one more entry after moving to the bunker. But those dictations were typed or written, not microfilmed, and they remained in the Reich Chancellery when it fell to Soviet forces. Fourth, we know what happened to the physical location. On May 2, 1945, the day after Goebbels' suicide, Soviet troops discovered and took possession of the abandoned bunker. They went through German archives with more vigor than discrimination. They shipped some materials to Moscow. They destroyed some. They left the rest scattered and trampled underfoot. When American journalist James O'Donnell entered the bunker on July 4, 1945, he found it flooded, cluttered, and reeking. But lying around for anyone to pick up were historic documents. Hitler's appointment book, Martin Bormann's diary, battle logs for Berlin, and fragments of Joseph Goebbels' diary. These fragments were burned, singed, trampled. Many pages were missing. Some had been deliberately destroyed. Others had simply been caught in the chaos of Berlin's fall. So we have a picture emerging. Goebbels continued documenting until close to the end. But the entries from April 11th through May 1st were never microfilmed, never properly archived, and were lost in the maelstrom of Berlin's collapse. The question becomes, was this loss accidental or intentional? To understand what might have been in those missing pages, we need to look at what Goebbels wrote in the weeks leading up to April 10th. The existing entries from February through early April 1945 paint a disturbing psychological portrait. Goebbels was living in an alternate reality constructed from equal parts propaganda, delusion, and desperate hope. He obsessively documented military situations, always finding glimmers of hope in the darkest defeats. When the Allies crossed the Rhine, Goebbels wrote that there was definite fear of the Rhine among Allied commanders, claiming they couldn't carry out operations deep in Germany like their amphibious assaults. 2 days later, alarming news proved him catastrophically wrong. He convinced himself that the alliance between the Soviets and the Western powers was on the verge of collapse. He wrote repeatedly about political crises in the enemy camp growing to considerable magnitude. He told himself that if only Germany could hold on a little longer, the Allies would turn on each other and give Germany a chance to negotiate. Historians who have studied these entries describe them as childish, not in a dismissive way, but in the sense that Goebbels had unimpeded access to the crude emotional processes of early childhood. He could cling to fantasies with a tenacity that defied all evidence. When reality contradicted his beliefs, he simply created new fantasies to explain the contradictions away. He blamed others for German defeats, particularly Hermann Göring, whom he despised. He documented his meetings with Hitler, always portraying the Führer as a genius whose plans were being sabotaged by incompetent subordinates. And throughout it all, there's a dark undercurrent of violence and hatred. In one entry, Goebbels wrote about Jews. So what might Goebbels have written in those final 3 weeks? Based on witness testimony from the bunker, we can construct a psychological profile of his final days. On April 20th, Hitler celebrated his 56th birthday in the bunker. It was a brief ceremony. Top Nazis like Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler came to Berlin to pay their respects, then immediately fled, never to see Hitler again. This would have devastated Goebbels. He saw these departures as acts of betrayal. On April 22nd, Hitler suffered what witnesses described as a complete nervous breakdown. For the first time, he admitted openly that Germany would lose the war. He ordered most of the bunker staff evacuated to Berchtesgaden. He released his military high command. The edifice of Nazi power was crumbling by the hour. But Goebbels stayed, and he brought his children. On April 29th, Hitler married Eva Braun. Goebbels served as a witness at the ceremony. In the early morning hours of April 30th, Hitler dictated his political testament. He named Goebbels as Reich Chancellor, his successor. Later that same day, April 30th, at approximately 3:30 p.m., Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide in Hitler's private quarters. Their bodies were carried up to the garden of the Reich Chancellery and burned with gasoline. The children heard the gunshot. According to Secretary Traudl Junge, 9-year-old Helmut Goebbels thought it was a mortar landing nearby and shouted, "That was a bullseye!" He had no idea he had just heard the suicide of Adolf Hitler. That night, Goebbels sent a message to the Soviet command requesting an armistice. Stalin demanded unconditional surrender. Goebbels refused. He made his decision. He would not leave the bunker. He would not surrender. And he would not allow his children to live in a world where their father was remembered as a war criminal. On the evening of May 1st, the Goebbels children were given morphine injections by SS dentist Helmut Kuntz. Once they were unconscious, either Magda Goebbels or Hitler's personal physician Ludwig Stumpfegger crushed cyanide capsules in each child's mouth. Shortly after, Joseph and Magda Goebbels walked up the stairs to the Chancellery garden. According to various accounts, they either bit cyanide capsules and were shot immediately after, or they were shot on their request by Goebbels' adjutant. Their bodies were doused with petrol but only partially burned. Soviet troops found the charred remains on May 2nd. So what do historians think Goebbels wrote in those final diary entries? Based on the pattern of his earlier writings, his known psychology, and witness testimony, scholars have developed several theories. Some historians believe the missing entries might document the final collapse of Goebbels' carefully maintained fantasy. The April 10th entry's lack of commentary might signal the beginning of this breakdown, a moment when Goebbels could no longer sustain the optimistic spin that characterized his earlier entries. If so, the lost pages might contain something unprecedented in the Goebbels diaries, an acknowledgement of defeat, perhaps even doubt, perhaps questions about whether everything he had believed and fought for had been a terrible mistake. This theory suggests the pages were deliberately destroyed, not by Goebbels himself, but by others who found them after his death. The Soviets, or even German survivors, might have recognized that such a confession would be too valuable, too dangerous to allow to survive. Other scholars believe exactly the opposite. They argue that Goebbels, master propagandist to the end, used those final entries to craft his ultimate propaganda piece, the martyrdom of Joseph Goebbels. We know he was obsessed with how history would remember him. His final letters, smuggled out of the bunker by pilot Hannah Reich, were carefully worded propaganda documents designed to present his suicide and the murder of his children as noble sacrifices rather than war crimes. If this theory is correct, the missing diary entries might have been even more disturbing than what survived. They might have contained elaborate justifications for murdering his children. They might have positioned himself and Hitler as tragic heroes destroyed by lesser men. They might have been so transparently self-serving that even Goebbels recognized they undermined his legacy rather than enhanced it. In this scenario, Goebbels himself might have ordered the final entries destroyed. Better to leave history with questions than with answers that exposed him as a monster and a fraud. There's a third possibility that some historians consider most likely. The missing entries were simply lost in the chaos. Berlin in late April 1945 was apocalyptic. Buildings burned. Artillery shells fell constantly. The Soviet army was fighting street by street. In the Reich chancellery, people were burning documents to keep them from Soviet hands. Fires were started intentionally and accidentally. Water flooded into the bunker complex. The microfilm system that had preserved everything up to April 10th was gone. Whatever Goebbels dictated after that point existed only as physical papers in a building that was being systematically destroyed. When American journalist James O'Donnell found diary fragments on July 4th, many pages were already singed, burned, trampled, and water-damaged. Perhaps there's no mystery at all. Perhaps those final entries simply burned like so much else in Berlin's final days. The story of the Goebbels diaries doesn't end with those missing pages. In fact, the recovery of what did survive is its own remarkable tale. In 1947, American journalist Louis Lochner was shown what appeared to be fragments of Goebbels's diaries from 1942 and 1943. They had been found in the courtyard of Goebbels's ministry, singed and smelling of smoke, apparently having narrowly escaped destruction. Lochner was initially skeptical. The documents were typewritten in large type, not handwritten. But as he read, his conviction grew that these were authentic. He spent months verifying them, comparing them to a handwritten diary fragment from 1925 to 1926 that had also survived. The verification process was complicated by Cold War politics. When Doubleday published Lochner's edited version in 1948, the Soviet Union immediately attacked the diaries as an American hoax. Soviet Ambassador Andrei Gromyko stood before the United Nations General Assembly and called them old rubbish. Why would the Soviets react so strongly? Because they had a secret. They possessed the mother lode. In May 1945, Soviet soldiers had discovered 200 partially burned volumes in the ruins of Berlin. They found the buried boxes of glass microfilm plates in Potsdam. All of it was shipped to Moscow's Central State Archives and locked away. For 47 years, these materials sat untouched in Soviet vaults. The communist authorities occasionally released small portions to East German researchers, but they held back the most significant material. Perhaps they saw its historical value. Perhaps they hoped to use it for propaganda purposes. Perhaps they simply didn't want to give the West such a comprehensive look into Nazi thinking. In March 1992, researcher Elke Fröhlich discovered the glass plates in the Moscow archives. She immediately recognized their significance. The Sunday Times paid controversial historian David Irving $125,000 to authenticate and translate the newly discovered material. Between 1993 and 2008, a 29-volume German edition of the complete diaries was published by the Institute für Zeitgeschichte in Munich. Scholars describe the edition as 98% complete. That 2% that's missing? It includes those final entries from April 11th through May 1st, 1945. The missing diary entries aren't just a historical curiosity. They represent a significant gap in our understanding of one of history's darkest periods. Goebbels was there at the center of Nazi power from the beginning to the end. He participated in the planning of Kristallnacht. He wrote extensively about the final solution. He documented private conversations with Hitler that historians rely on to understand the Führer's thinking. If those final entries survived, what might they tell us about Hitler's mental state in his last days? About the decision-making process that led to the murder of the Goebbels children? About whether there were opportunities to save lives that were deliberately squandered? Some scholars argue that the missing entries might contain information about the fate of art and gold looted by the Nazis. Others suggest they might reveal more about the conspiracy theories and delusions that drove Nazi leadership even as defeat became inevitable. Still, others believe they might document last-minute attempts at negotiation that official records don't show. But there's another political dimension to this story. For decades, Holocaust deniers and neo-Nazis have seized on the fact that portions of the Goebbels diaries were initially questioned by Soviet authorities. They've used this to sow doubt about the authenticity of all Nazi documentation. The missing entries feed into these conspiracies. What are historians hiding? What don't they want us to know? The absence of information becomes, in twisted hands, evidence of a cover-up. This is precisely why the historical record matters so much. Every gap is an opportunity for those who would rewrite history to insert their own false narratives. While the diary entries were lost, we do have other documents from Goebbels' final days that provide clues about his state of mind. On April 29th, both Joseph and Magda Goebbels wrote final letters. They gave these letters to pilot Hannah Reich, who flew out of the besieged city, along with the newly appointed head of the German Air Force. Magda wrote to Harold Quandt, her adult son from a previous marriage, who was being held as a prisoner of war. The letter is chilling in its matter-of-fact acceptance of mass murder. She wrote about staying with Hitler to the end, about the rightness of their cause, about her intention to die with her younger children. Joseph's letters were even more revealing. He wrote a propaganda manifesto designed to put, in historian Hugh Trevor Roper's words, the correct propagandist gloss on this final gesture of annihilation. Museum curator Stephen Luckert analyzed these letters and concluded that Goebbels was using even his final communications for propaganda purposes. The letters were designed, Luckert noted, to leave his contemporaries and posterity with a flattering portrait of himself and to promote National Socialism. Even in death, Goebbels was performing. Even facing the end, he was crafting his image for history. This gives us a clue about what those missing diary entries might have contained. If Goebbels' final letters were propaganda, his final diary entries were likely the same. He wasn't recording truth. He was staging a performance for future historians. 80 years later, we're left with more questions than answers. Did Joseph Goebbels have a moment of clarity in those final days? Did he recognize the magnitude of what he had done? Did he express remorse for the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust, for the millions more killed in the war he helped instigate, for his own children whose lives he ended? Or did he remain a true believer until the last moment, his diary entries filled with the same delusional conspiracy theories and hatred that characterized the rest of his writing? We know from those who were in the bunker that Goebbels remained loyal to Hitler to the end. We know he rejected opportunities to save his children. We know he chose death over surrender, but we don't know what he wrote. We don't know his private thoughts in those final hours. We don't know if there was any humanity left beneath the propaganda. In the end, Goebbels' missing diary pages may be the truest thing he ever left behind. He spent his life shaping propaganda and trying to script his own legacy. Yet, when the Third Reich collapsed, his final words simply disappeared. Maybe they held a confession, maybe another lie. We'll never know. And that uncertainty is fitting, because Goebbels' real legacy isn't in anything he wrote. It's in what he couldn't spin away, the camps, the ruins, the millions dead, even his own children. History always has gaps, but sometimes the silence says more than the words. Goebbels wanted to explain himself to the future. Instead, he left a void. And for a man who devoted his life to controlling the narrative, that empty space may be the most honest ending he could have had. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, hit like and subscribe for more untold stories from history. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.